We will now turn to Professor Abbas Vali. Professor Abbas is a political and social theorist specializing in modern and contemporary Middle Eastern politics. He obtained a PhD in sociology from the University of London in 1983. He has held academic positions at the Universities of Wales, Swansea, Boğaziçi, and served as president of the University of Kurdistan, Howler. His research focuses on Kurdish nationalism, political theory, and sociology of the Middle East. Professor Abbas, welcome to this panel. And my question for you is, how are today's political, social, and technological changes reshaping Kurdish identity? And do you think these changes bring Kurds closer together, or do they create more divisions?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start with a note of thanks for the American University of Iraq in Sulaimani, and also the Kashkool Foundation for making it possible for me to be here and to meet with you and to speak and with you and take part in this session. Thank you for that. Identity is a contentious concept. It's much contested, and these contests always revealed the ambiguities which are in the concept or are associated with the concept. In the context of today's discussion in relation to the Kurds and Kurdish identity, I can refer to two different sets of ambiguities which surround the concept and its usage in the literature, either social, scientific, or political, or literary discourses. The first set of ambiguities that are related to the concept of identity, these are basically ambiguities that exist in the theoretical construction of the concept. How this concept is constructed and how it is used. When we talk about, and then I come to the second one in relation to the Kurds. When we talk about the concept of identity, identity always theoretically presupposes the existence of another. The other. Identity simply is impossible without having another. So identity is related theoretically to the existence of another, and the relationship between this self and the other is mediated via the notion of difference. Difference defines the core of the identity. This difference is, and what is known as identity politics, which is also very contentious. Identity politics is a kind of politics that revolves around this difference and the idea, or say discourses, practices, struggles, which are all related to the idea of recognition of and respect for this difference or differences. Here, difference should not be misunderstood. The idea of difference always related to some form of oppression, some form of injustice. Therefore, the subject of this difference, the holder of this difference, always complains about being not recognized, always being excluded, oppressed, and so on. So in relation to that, we must say that this difference should not be understood as a claim for a universal justice. There is no universal justice should be attached to this idea. It is really different from, the idea of difference is related to what I want to be, but it is not being recognized. Therefore, this difference here is the right to be different. Now, should not be sort of here understood as a universal right, like human rights or so on and so forth. This is the right to be different. My right to be different should be recognized, and the fact that I want to be different should be recognized. This is unrespected. Recognition and respected legally, politically, of course, is always attached to the question of rights, and the question of rights is by definition is related to the question of power. Therefore, identity, the question of difference, oppression, suppression, exclusion is always related to the question of power. Now here, there are differences, but one fundamental difference is very important, and that is called the constitutive difference. Constitutive difference is exactly what defines my conditions in relation to my other. But a lot of the ambiguities that are surrounding the question of difference, therefore of identity, relates to the idea that how this difference is perceived. In most literature, particularly on the idea in literary discourses, even in social scientific discourses, the idea that about difference, the relationship between self and other, is perceived as being two entities, as being external, exterior to each other. This obviously is not what identity in terms of political philosophy or in philosophical discourse is meant. I mean, it is what difference is. I mean, I refer here to what Derrida says. Derrida says difference is what makes presence possible. If we don't have any difference, we have no presence. That is what makes it. Therefore, the idea that here I'm talking about is that this exteriority of me and my other, myself and my other, is the source of grave misunderstanding. In philosophical discourse, in relation to identity, throughout the modernity, and of course in contemporary philosophical discourse, post-structuralism, it is always insisted that the relationship between self and other is the relationship of interiority. It is not the relationship of exteriority. This fundamental question, this fundamental issue is very, very important. That means that if we are talking about the idea that whether and this I am coming to the Kurdish identity, whether this identity is mutable or immutable, it is changeable or unchangeable, is it modern or is it ancient or primordial? All comes back to the idea that how I see my other in this relationship of interiority. And if we see that, this interiority, if I talk about whether Kurdish identity is mutable, has changed or is changing now, therefore I should first address my relationship to my other. My others here in relation to the Kurds, the situation is a little bit more complicated. Because as you know, we don't have one other. We have four others. We have the Turks in Turkey. We have the Persians in Iran. We have Arabs in Iraq. And we have Arabs in Syria. And we have this multiple others, so to speak. And obviously, this tells us that to argue and state that, either politically or some nationalist discourses want to say, and they insist on that Kurdish identity is one uniform bloc, and that through history this has evolved as a uniform bloc. I would say, at least in modern times, this is not true. It has been subjected to various geopolitical changes, and the relationship of the Kurds in Bakur, in Turkey, to its other, which is the Turkish state and Turkish culture and Turkish establishment, and in a sense even Turkish civil society, the relationship is very different to the one which is now in Iraq, and the relationship which is now in Syria, and the relationship which is now in Iran. It is a fragmented identity, and the identity politics, or the politics which is to follow from this, would also be fragmented. Now, whether this is something good or that bad, it is open to debate. But what is important here is that, from my point of view, Kurdish identity, this fragmentation in modern times, also gives a very important character to Kurdish identity, and that is extraterritoriality or extra-nationality, if you take national units of Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. Now we are sitting here. We have Kurds from Iraq, Kurds from Turkey, we have Kurds from Iran, and Kurds from Syria. We are all Kurds. In relation to one another, our presence, we are all Kurds. But in relation to our others, we certainly are very different. And this is a complicated issue in relation to the Kurdish identity. Now, one question that it is in the heart of this, whether Kurdish identity has remained the same, or has this identity changed over time, I think it is fundamentally, aside from this issue that I discussed, is fundamentally a political issue. It is really a political issue. It depends on how you look at it. And when I say political issue, in the context of Kurds and Kurdish question, we are always talking about national identity. Seldom we are talking about identity of individual or group. Mostly, almost always, we are talking about national identity. Now, the question here is that when I said the idea of whether it's Kurdish question, the Kurdish identity has remained, fixed, or it is, changeable, has changed, and so on and so forth, depends on the nature of this nationalist politics in the context of which we are discussing it. From an ethnicist primordialist position, if you look at it, Kurdish identity has never changed and will not change, and it is always fixed. And this is that we always stand in opposition to our, and this approach clearly relates the idea of Kurdish identity to the existence or presence or the absence of a national state. This is absolutely fundamental. In this respect, it is, so for them, the idea of nationalism, national identity, or forms of subjectivity, which are formed in the context of nationalist politics in relation to perceptions or direct practices against the state or perceptions of a state, now we come to this issue that this is idea of the state and the nation state and the Kurdish identity, if it's to achieve or receive, to be recognition and respect that required for this, the framework of the Kurdish nation state is absolutely necessary. It is a must. Now, that is the kind of approach. But there is another approach which looks at the idea in a more concrete way. And that is, it says that the idea of relationship between identity in the context of a nationalist politics which relates it to the existence of a Kurdish or nation state, this is always assumed in the context of one nation, one state, you see. But unfortunately, at present, in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, in Turkey, we are living in societies which are multinational. These societies are multinational. And this idea of multinationality of these societies basically opens up a new way for approach. Now, whether one accepts, here I'm not passing any judgment, I am basically explaining. Now, here, in this one, say that because of the changes that ever since, 1918, that, and the formation of Kurdish communities and identity and so on in the context of multinational states and its development and evolution. For instance, now Iraq after 2003 is fundamentally different to Iraq before 2003. So, you have a constitution which recognizes binational. It says sovereignty in Iraq, sovereignty is never divisible. It is indivisible sovereignty, but under sovereignty, you can have power sharing.
Sorry, Professor Abbas, we're running low on time. If you could just...
What I'm trying to say that those who believe that now we are living in multinational states, they think that, geopolitics of this region has resulted in a paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift is fundamentally this, that relationship between the state and the nation state is become problematic. The relationship between national identity and national sovereignty has become problematic. And because they have become problematic in the context of multinational states that we are living in currently in the Syria, therefore this paradigm change is a real, true issue which has to be addressed. And if it has been addressed, therefore the consequences, theoretical and philosophical, or I'll say more theoretical consequences of it, should be taken into account in rethinking and possibly reconstructing Kurdish identity in the light of developments that has led to the present situation and the situation in which we all live now.
You mentioned that the existence of the other is very important for the construction of identity and national identity. I want to bring your focus to Bashur. Since 1991, and then especially after 2003, the Kurds themselves have been responsible for their own affairs, and especially for that generation that was born in those areas, in those eras. We don't have this other very strongly in our collective imagination, and I would like to know your perspective on what is the consequence of that, and yeah.
Yes, I mean, what I said is this, that theoretically, and for that matter, philosophically, the whole idea of identity without an other is simply impossible. And what regulates the difference between the relationship between the two is the notion of difference. Now, before 2003, the relationship of the Kurdish community or Kurdish society in Iraq, better society, I would say, to the state and power was very different than after 2003, more specifically after in 2004 or 5 when the Constitution was written and it was approved. Now, in that Constitution, the existence of the Kurds and Kurdish society in Iraq as an identity, as a nation, has been recognized now. And that recognition is followed by the language rights and, above all, regional self-government. Now, nobody can say that now these changes that have happened has not affected the forms of differences that existed between the Kurdish community or Kurdish society and the Ba'athist state. You see, we didn't have that at all and it's stipulated. But one thing is very important here, that Iraq, in terms of national sovereignty, has a notion of sovereignty which is indivisible, and that is recognized internationally. You see, you have an Iraqi foreign minister, which is a Kurd, but Iraqi foreign minister is representing the sovereignty of the state of Iraq as a uniform political entity. But in terms of the relationship between Kurdish society and its political representation and Iraq, now I think the relationship revolves around different sets of they revolves around the very different forms of, let's say, differences. And that means that the relationship of, what I would say here, like the social scientists would say, in Iraq, we are experiencing or are encountering what they call a paradigm change here. The relationship of the Kurds to the nation state has changed. The relationship of the Kurds to national identity and national identity to sovereignty has changed. Now, this is very important. But this is how people who believe in this paradigm change. If you talk to an Orthodox, ethnic nationalist, Kurdish Orthodox ethnic nationalist, he would not accept this argument. His argument would say that, you can't talk about changes in identity if it is not related to the existence of a Kurdish state. Now, that is how he would read this. But those who believe that there has been a paradigm change, they would believe that now, yes, the whole idea of Kurdish identity in the context of Iraqi state in relation to power, in relation to the practice of power, in relation to the rights, in relation to culture, everything has changed. It has to be reconstructed. Now, these are two different approaches, but those different approaches basically are related to different relationship that these people have to the notion of Kurdish nation state as being represented. I mean, in Turkey as well now. In Turkey, I think the dominant argument, insofar as I know, in Turkey is one which says that the relationship of the Kurds to the idea of the nation state has changed. But whether that is acceptable in civil society or not, that's another. But in the Kurdish movement, that's the argument. So my idea is that identity is fundamentally relational. And the idea of fixed identity is contradiction in terms. You cannot basically have a fixed identity. If it is related to difference, then identity is relational. But how this relationship is being shaped, in what sense, that's open to argument.
Thank you so much